sentences. Remember the three types of sentences that you should already know. A simple sentence just has one independent clause. A compound sentence has two independent clauses, and this example shows you the two independent clauses joined with a comma and the conjunction and. A complex sentence has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Remember, these are some of the conjunctions that can be used with a comma to make a compound sentence. You join two independent clauses with these conjunctions. And this makes one type of compound sentence. Here are some examples of those compound sentences. The waiter brought us some water, and we looked at the menus. We have two sentences here, and they are joined with the comma and the conjunction and. Look at the next one. The cyclist used all of his energy, but he rode up the steep hill very slowly. Again, we have two sentences, and these two sentences are joined with a comma and the conjunction but. This makes a compound sentence. But there's another way to make a compound sentence, and that's with transition words. These are just some of the transition words that you can use in your writing. You need to memorize these words because they are punctuated differently than the conjunctions. Here are some examples of this type of compound sentence. I was late to work, therefore my boss is not happy. Again, I have two sentences, and I'm joining them with a transition word, therefore. Notice the punctuation. When I use a transition word, I have to put a semicolon in front of the word and a comma after the word. Look at the next example. Saving money is not easy. However, it is a good habit to follow. Again, I have two sentences, and I'm joining them with a transition word. So I have to put the semicolon in front of the transition and a comma after the transition. This makes a second type of compound sentence. Let's look at a couple more examples. Jane needs to buy a new car. Also, she needs money for her tuition. Also is another transition word, and it's joining two sentences, so we put a semicolon in front of it and a comma after it. Look at the next one. He needs to study harder, otherwise he is not going to pass the class. We used otherwise to join these two sentences, and we put the semicolon in front and the comma after. So remember that list of transition words that you can use like this. You'll punctuate them all the same with a semicolon in front of the transition and a comma after the transition. Let's check your understanding. These are some sentences that have not been punctuated. Pause the video and write these sentences down. This is good practice for you. In each sentence, decide if you need to add punctuation or not. Some of them may need no punctuation. But if it's a compound sentence, you'll need to do something. Remember that before a conjunction, you put just a comma. For a transition word, you'll put a semicolon and a comma. Pause the video now and do the exercise. Let's see how you did. In the first one, we had a transition word joining two sentences, so we need to put a semicolon in front of however and a comma after. In the second sentence, we just had a simple sentence. It's not a compound sentence, because after and, we don't have a subject and verb. Remember, you have to join two sentences together to have a compound sentence. In this sentence, we just have two objects joined by and, so you don't put a comma. Look at the third sentence. We're joining two sentences with the transition therefore, so we put a semicolon in front of it and a comma after it. On the fourth sentence, we joined two sentences with the conjunction so we need to put a comma in front of it. On the next one, we joined two sentences with the transition then, so again, a semicolon in front and a comma after. The same thing on the last one. We had two sentences and we're joining them with the transition thus. So put a semicolon in front of it and a comma after it. It's pretty easy, right? As long as you remember the two groups of words. You put a comma in front of conjunctions and you put a semicolon in front of a transition with a comma after it. There is one other type of compound sentence that you might use occasionally. In this type of compound sentence, we only use a semicolon to join two sentences. Look at the first example. Susan is very healthy. She usually walks to work. Notice that these two sentences are very closely related, and we kind of have the meaning of and here. Susan is very healthy and she usually walks to work, right? You can imagine that. When we have two sentences that are very closely related and have the idea of and, we can use a semicolon by itself to join the two sentences. Notice I don't have a conjunction or transition here. I'm just using a semicolon, and it has kind of the meaning of and. Look at the next example. The music was loud. Everyone was dancing. Again, notice that these two sentences are very closely related, and we could imagine saying and here. When your sentences are closely related, you can join them with a semicolon. However, be careful that you do not use this method or this type of sentence too much in your writing. Maybe only one time per page, or maybe one time per paragraph, but not more than that. So remember, there are three types of compound sentences that you can put in your writing. The first type uses a comma and conjunction, like and, but, or so. The second type of compound sentence uses a semicolon with a transition and a comma. Transitions are words like therefore or however. The third type of compound sentence uses a semicolon only. And remember, you can only do that when the two sentences are very closely related. This lesson is about adverb clauses. Remember that a simple sentence just has one independent clause. A compound sentence has two independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction. And a complex sentence has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. We're looking at complex sentences in this lesson. Here are some examples. While Sam washed his face, we listened to music. Or you could say, we listened to music while Sam washed his face. Both of these sentences are correct. They are both complex sentences. Look at the next pair. Jeff ate an apple when he got home from work. You can also turn it around. When Jeff got home from work, he ate an apple. Both of these are also complex sentences. Look at the last pair. After I graduated from college, I started working. You can also say, I started working after I graduated from college. All of these are complex sentences, and from these examples you can see that we can write the complex sentences two different ways. Now before we go any further, you need to make sure you understand what a dependent clause is. Here we have our sentence. This is a complex sentence. While Sam washed his face, we listened to music. The dependent clause is this part, while Sam washed his face. The reason this is dependent is because it cannot be a sentence. This is not a sentence by itself. And the reason for that is because of this word while. While is an adverb clause connector. When you start with an adverb clause connector, you need a subject and a verb. We do have that, but we don't have a complete thought. While Sam washed his face, what? What's the rest of the sentence? So this is not a complete sentence, it's a dependent clause. And dependent clauses have to be attached to an independent clause. Here's another dependent clause. When Jeff got home from work. Well, when Jeff got home from work, what? What's the rest of the idea? We don't know, so this is not a complete sentence. And the reason is because of the adverb clause connector, when. Here's another example. This is a dependent clause. It's not a complete sentence because we have the connector after. So remember that dependent clauses will start with an adverb clause connector, and then they'll have a subject and a verb. That group of words will make up your dependent clause. And dependent clauses are one part of complex sentences. Let's look at those sentences again. Now we said that each adverb clause can be written two different ways. If you look at the first pair of sentences, while Sam washed his face, do you recognize that? You should know now that that's a dependent clause because of the adverb clause connector while. And the other part of our sentence, we listened to music, is the independent clause. So remember, a complex sentence has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. Now in this sentence, the dependent clause is in front of the independent clause. When your dependent clause is first, when it starts the sentence, we have to put the comma after the dependent clause. In the other sentence, we changed the order. We listened to music is our independent clause, remember? But this time, it's starting the sentence. So when you start with the independent clause, you do not put a comma in the sentence. There's no comma before while. Look at the next pair. Jeff ate an apple when he got home from work. Can you find the dependent clause? When he got home from work is the dependent clause. It starts with the connector when. And because this is in the middle of the sentence, we don't put a comma. But if we turn it around and put the dependent clause first, then we put a comma after it. Look at the last pair. After I graduated from college, I started working. We started with the dependent clause this time. After is our connector, so that's the dependent clause, and we have to put a comma after it. But when we turn it around and we start with the independent clause, we do not put a comma. All of the dependent clauses in these sentences with the independent clause, you do not put a comma in the sentence. There's no comma before while. Look at the next pair. Jeff ate an apple when he got home from work. Can you find the dependent clause? When he got home from work is the dependent clause. It starts with the connector when. And because this is in the middle of the sentence, we don't put a comma. But if we turn it around and put the dependent clause first, then we put a comma after it. Look at the last pair. After I graduated from college, I started working. We started with the dependent clause this time. After is our connector, so that's the dependent clause, and we have to put a comma after it. But when we turn it around and we start with the independent clause, we do not put a comma. All of the dependent clauses in these sentences are called adverb clauses. Here are some of the common adverb clause connectors: after, while, before, if, although, when, since, and because. You've probably seen these before and used them before, but now you should know how to correctly punctuate sentences with these words. Remember that when you see these words in the middle of a sentence, you don't put a comma. Here are some other adverb clause connectors. These are not as common, and you may not have learned these before, but they work just the same. If you put these adverb clause connectors in the middle of a sentence, you don't put a comma. If you start a sentence with one of these connectors, then you'll put a comma at the end of that dependent clause. Let's check your understanding. Pause the video and on a piece of paper, decide if these sentences need commas or not. Put the comma where you think it goes. Remember, some of the sentences don't need commas. Pause the video now. Let's check your answers. How did you do? We don't put a comma on the first one because we started the sentence with an independent clause. You don't put a comma when because is in the middle of the sentence. The second sentence has the adverb clause connector even though, and it's starting the sentence. So our dependent clause is in front of the independent clause. Now we need a comma. In the third sentence, we started with the independent clause, and our dependent clause starts with if. That's in the middle of the sentence, so we don't put a comma. On the next one, we started with the independent clause again. Our dependent clause connector was since, and that's in the middle of the sentence, so there's no comma. On the next one, we start the sentence with the dependent clause. Although this book is interesting is a dependent clause, and we put the comma after it. The next one also has a comma. Before is a connector, and we have the dependent clause before I cook dinner, starting the sentence. The last sentence, we started the sentence with an independent clause. Unless Bob wants to drive is the dependent clause, but it follows the independent clause, so no comma. Let's review. You use a Bob wants to drive is the dependent clause, but it follows the independent clause, so no comma. Let's review. You use a comma if a dependent clause starts a sentence. So if you see a dependent clause connector at the beginning of the sentence, find the end of that dependent clause and put a comma. The comma goes between the dependent clause and the independent clause. You don't use a comma if the independent clause starts the sentence. It's pretty easy, right? Watch the video again or do some practice exercises. In this lesson, you'll learn more about using commas. You've already learned about compound sentences and how we join two independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction, like and or but. You've also learned about compound sentences where we join the two independent clauses with a transition word like therefore, and we use a semicolon and a comma to punctuate those. You've also learned to use commas in a series or a list of things. Remember, when you have a series of 3 or more items, that means 3 nouns, verbs, or adjectives, you need to put commas between them. Now we're going to learn about using commas with introductory phrases. An introductory phrase is a group of words that starts your sentence but does not belong to the main clause of the sentence. You can usually find an introductory phrase because it comes before the subject of the sentence. Look at the first sentence. Due to the bad weather, our game was canceled. Due to the bad weather is an introductory phrase. We can take this off and we still have the sentence, our game was canceled. That's your main clause. So the introductory phrase comes before the main clause and you put a comma to separate them. In the next sentence, on Monday my teacher announced a test. On Monday is the introductory phrase, so we put a comma after it. In the next one, after dinner, Steve watched the news. After dinner is the introductory phrase. It goes before the main clause of the sentence, so we put a comma after it. In the next one, because of traffic is the introductory phrase. And in the last one, for several months is the introductory phrase. We also need to use commas with interrupting phrases. Interrupting phrases interrupt your sentence. You'll usually find them between the subject and the verb, but they can go anywhere in the sentence. Look at the first one. The mayor, by the way, will be at the... By the way is interrupting our main clause, so we need to separate it with commas. If the interrupting phrase is in the middle of the sentence, you'll need 2 commas. Look at the next one. This is the reason, therefore, that you should buy a house. Therefore is our interrupting phrase. We could take this word out and our sentence would be fine without it. So therefore is interrupting the sentence, and we have to put commas around it. In the last one, Joe wants to buy a house too. To is our interrupting phrase. Now it's actually at the end of the sentence, but it's extra information, and we have to separate it with a comma. If your interrupting phrase comes at the end of the sentence, you'll only use 1 comma. Here are some other interrupting elements. These are adjective clauses. Look at the first sentence. My roommate, who hates seafood, doesn't want me to cook shrimp. Who hates seafood is extra information in this sentence, and it's interrupting the main sentence. I could take this out, but I want to use it for extra information. When I do that, I have to put commas around it. So there's a comma in front and a comma after the interrupting element. Look at the second example. The dress which I bought for tonight is too tight for me to wear. Again, this interrupting element is extra information. I'm describing something about the dress, but because it's extra information and it's interrupting the rest of the sentence, I have to separate it with commas. Try this exercise for practice. Decide if the sentence needs commas or not. Pause the video and write your answers on some paper. Pause the video now. Now check your answers. The words in red are introductory phrases and interrupting words. Make sure that you put commas in the correct places. Let's review. Remember, red are introductory phrases and interrupting words. Make sure that you put commas in the correct places. Let's review. Remember that you need commas in compound sentences that have conjunctions. You put a comma before conjunctions like and, but, and or. You also use commas in a series when you have 3 or more nouns, verbs, or adjectives. We also saw that you use commas after an introductory phrase. Introductory phrases start your sentence and they come before the subject of the sentence. Put a comma after these phrases. We also put commas around any interrupting phrases and clauses. When a phrase interrupts the rest of your sentence, you separate it by commas. This short lesson will show you several different uses for the transition words. In the first sentence that you saw, therefore was being used as a connector for a compound sentence. As you've already learned, when you join two independent clauses with a transition word, you have to put a semicolon in front and a comma after. You also saw this sentence. In this sentence, therefore is being used as an introductory phrase. And as you already learned, introductory phrases need a comma after them. You also saw a sentence with therefore being used as an interrupting phrase. Remember that when a transition word interrupts a sentence, you put commas around it. So if it's in the middle of the sentence, you would have a comma before and after the transition word. Look at some more examples. All of these sentences have therefore. Can you decide how therefore is being used in each one? Look at the first one. This is the reason that you should buy a house is a complex sentence. Therefore is just an interrupting word, so we put commas around it. Look at the second sentence. Here we have two independent clauses, and we're joining them with therefore. So remember to put a semicolon in front and a comma after. Look at the third sentence. Here we have two separate sentences, but in the second sentence I'm using an introductory phrase, so I put a comma after therefore. Here's a list of some other transition words that have different uses. Some of these words can go in the same places as therefore, but some of the words, like first, cannot be used as an interrupting phrase. Just keep in mind that these can be used in some different ways. It'll take practice to learn how they're all used. How did you do on the exercise? In the first sentence, thus was being used as an interrupting phrase. Even though that's a long sentence, it's just a simple sentence. And because thus is interrupting, we put commas around it. In the second sentence, however was being used to join two sentences. So we use a semicolon in front of it and a comma after. In the third sentence, we had an introductory phrase, in addition, so we put a comma after it. And in the last sentence, we had an interrupting word that was at the end of the sentence, so we put a comma in front of also. Remember that transition words can be punctuated in several different ways.